Greetings everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on Genesis of Bhakti movement. In this lecture, I would be discussing the origins of Bhakti movement from early medieval period onwards. However, before we delve into the theme of Bhakti movement, I would be discussing what were several pre-Bhakti traditions with reference to female participation and with reference to gender identity. Before the Bhakti movement began fueling women's passions for liberation, there were two major literary genres that produced similar anthologies of women's writings. As we talk about the pre-Bhakti traditions, an analysis of the women poets of these forerunners of Bhakti literature reveals the roots of many of the themes, imagery as well as symbolism later revisited through the concept of Bhakti. One such movement was Buddhism, which emerged as a liberal religious literary movement. The first of these literary movements that can be described as one of the heterodox sects, Buddhism. Like the Bhakti movement, in this too, theology was the prominent force. The female Buddhist nuns, known as the Theris, who were contemporaries of the Buddha around 6th century BCE, sang several testimonials of how the Sangha and how Buddha had changed their lives. This was finally compiled in the form of Therigathas around 80 CE, and the anthology is definitely a storehouse of literature or poems written by women. The Therigathas, though, can be described as the first important initiative. Then another very important initiative was by Tamil Sangam poets, and they can also be described as the forerunners of Bhakti movement. Therigathas consist of 522 extant lyrics which described the rigors of the everyday lives of women and of how Sangha had provided asylum to these troubled women. Buddhist egalitarianism definitely attracted women from all walks of life, just like it had attracted other marginalized sections of society. The Therigathas as well as the Sangam poems, the Tamil Sangam poems, can be described as the forerunners of Bhakti movement. The courtesan Ambapali wrote about how Buddha leads the soul away from the burning fires of desire and luxury. So therefore, the social roots of Buddhism definitely owed a lot to the female participation. The Therigathas as well as the Tamil Sangam poems, as they emerged as forerunners of Bhakti movement, one can talk about several poems of some of the Theris, like Mutta. Mutta, who was one of the most prominent poets of this genre, describes Buddhism as freedom from the mortar and pestle and her dark and twisted lord. She declared sovereign control of her own body when she wrote, "Freed from rebirth and death I am, and all that has held me down is hurled away." So Mutta's song is very important and is an expression of feminine identity and the way she is loving her freedom. Significantly, Mutta is able to proclaim the idea of the self, and it was this very assertion of the feminine self that later on became the central theme of Bhakti poetry. So there was repeated reference to freedom from domesticity as well as from emotion, and the concept of freedom developed in Bhakti movement also several centuries later. In Buddhist theology, not being was freedom. Not being means not performing the tasks or not fulfilling the functions that one was expected to. For the theories, freedom was a metaphysical concept. Emotion, passion and longing were considered as the roadblocks, as the hurdles that would prevent one from being truly free. So, Sumangala Mata and Mitika, who were contemporaries of Mutta, expressed similar ideas which can be understood if one goes through the work of Therigathas. So, such women were questioning monotony. They were questioning wifehood and motherhood, as they wanted to break away from the monotony of routine domesticity. By joining the Sangha, both these women declared independence from domesticity and they were very happy to do so. The similar kind of reference appears in Ubiri's poems, where there was a slightly different conception of the theme of freedom. As has been remarked by scholars like Kumkum Roy and Uma Chakravarti, who are the translators of Ubiri's poems, how her perception of Buddhism is related to the concept of loss and bereavement. So, again a very personal expression of a woman being developed in the public domain. The grief that left me faint, all gone, the yearning stilled, to the Buddha, the Dhamma and the Sangha, I turn my heart now healed. So, Ubiri, after becoming a widow, wrote these lines, and since she had been forced to live a miserable life under the contemporary laws, so she was very relieved that she could escape the unjust system by joining the Sangha and doing what she wanted to do and enjoying the spiritual freedom. So, definitely one can say that Buddhism could be considered as a refuge from Brahmanical patriarchy. The theme of freedom was closer to the idea that was later on conceived by the female Bhakta poets. Now we come to the next genre of literary tradition, and that is Tamil Sangam poetry. Here also we come across several women poets who kind of provided the second significant feminist movement, and also can be described as a precursor to Bhakti movement. The Sangam age encompassed the period from 3rd to the 6th centuries CE. Patriotism was the vitalizing force behind most of the poetry of the age. Sangam literature was an arena for repressive notions of chastity and submissiveness for women. In most of the Sangam poems, we come across a duality between the external world, which is described as Puram, and the internal world, which is described as Akam. So, while the Puram was projected as masculine and the Akam was projected as internal or spiritual or feminine, and the women poets had to follow the rigid literary conventions of the patriarchal Sangam. As has been pointed out by Tharu and Lalita, a commentator as having said that the poems express the delight of a fairly new civilization with its material culture. So, as an urban culture was developing, as warfare was increasing, as trade was expanding, as new towns and urban areas were emerging, there was also in this course of celebration of the material culture, the burden of symbolizing spirituality was falling more and more on women of the Sangam age. Now, as you all know, that poetry was considered as, or any kind of writing, literary tradition was considered as a very serious courtly business, and a woman who wrote poetry was breaking taboos, was kind of falling into non-conformism, and was intruding into the political as well as the public space. So these poems as well as songs that have been composed by women and which were related to the day-to-day lives as well as to several emotions that they experienced are very valuable source of understanding the gender identity. So most of these poems were composed by women while they were working. The commentaries that accompany the translations of Sangam literature mention how important songs and poems were to the women, who used to sing these while performing several tasks like related to agriculture, like transplanting seeds or drawing water or husking paddy. And these songs were sung deliberately while working as women kept a vigil on their fields in order to impress the spirit, in order to charm the spirit that would ensure that the crops ripen at the right time. So there was some kind of a psychological metaphor also that was working behind. Now the concept of Akam and Puram emerges as separate spaces accorded to each gender, and how these separate spaces got crystallized into two distinct categories of poetry: the Akam poetry, which was related to the outer world, and the Puram poetry, which was related to the inner spiritual emotional lives of women. While the Akam poems dealt with an inner space and were usually love poems with characters like the pure heroine or the brave hero and the courtesan, everything else fell into the scope of the Puram poems. So the heroine of the Akam poems was usually confined to the surroundings of her house or to the general notions that were prevalent in society. She was made for love, for admiration, and the body of women was usually very sensually described in several of these poems. Such poems also dealt with historical figures and real events, those related to the Puram category. There were fixed images connotative of certain situations, like the wild jasmine in bloom and the dark clouds of monsoon rain, represented and evoked the grief of lovers who are separated. So whenever this kind of a poem had to be written, these metaphors had to be used. Then there was the Kurinsi, which was a wild mountain flower, which alluded to the first and then often the illegitimate sexual experience, and so on, as has been remarked by the scholar Ramanujan. Now, the theme of women's emancipation and the struggle to rid the society of several patriarchal oppressive ideologies were the major concerns in Bhakti literature. The theories and the women poets of the Sangam literature made the first significant feminist attempts to locate the self. The process found continuity in the works of several female bhaktas from 8th century onwards. In the south, where the movement originated, Bhakti held sway from the 8th to the late 18th centuries. One of the earliest known Bhakti poets, Karaikal Ammayar, dated around 8th century CE, was a Tamil Nayanar. Her poetry explored a personal path of worship to Shiva. The central motive of her poetry was some kind of a revolutionary relationship, very intense relationship that she professed she had with her Lord Shiva. The diction as well as the tone of her works do not confine her to any state of formal devotion. So, Karaikal Ammayar's poetry conveyed the great love and awe that Shiva inspired in her and did not fall in the parameters of traditional kind of a love or bhakti towards the Lord. Faith was no longer a series of rules that would describe the feminine self. In Karaikal Ammayar's poetry, faith became the spontaneous overflow of unsanctioned and repressed emotions. So, in due course of time, we see that poetry itself became bhakti and the female self began to be expressed in several ways. The influence of Ammayar's style can be found in the works of the long chain of female poet saints who followed. One of the most significant women poets of the tradition was Andal, a Vaishnavite Tamil poet, and how she emphasized total devotion and utter surrender to a personal god Krishna, for whom she wore flowers in her hair. The emphasis now shifted to the devotion and the use of regional language to spread the message of God, as that was more of a mass-based identity. It came to be emphasized that these two aspects were accessible to all and they could be used even by the lowly and the unlearned, the illiterate, to gain salvation. So, all that one needed was to seek refuge in God, worship Him, and to gain relief. And this worshipping no longer required any kind of dogma or any kind of agency of Brahmanical tradition. Now, a very important aspect that now I am going to discuss is the evolution of Bhakti movement and what all were the changes that took place in medieval society that were responsible for emergence of this kind of change. A number of far-reaching changes had taken place from early medieval period onwards, like agrarian expansion, large-scale craft specialization, amidst the political background of emerging regional kingdoms in all parts of India. The socio-economic preconditions for the rise of the Bhakti movement can be located as a set of interrelated and widespread changes in the production patterns that affected these socio-cultural political arenas, and they were reflected also through the religious sphere. There was a spread of feeling of regionalism that prepared the base for the vernaculars as well as for the Bhakti movement. With the coming of the Turks, there was a clearer mechanism to extract the surplus and pass it on to the ruling elite through the institution of Ikta system. And this also resulted in further intensification of feudal oppression and exploitation. Though the Turkish ruling class lived in the towns, the extraction of the surplus from the rural areas brought in enormous resources in their hands. So, a number of developments from 1200 to 1600 CE point out to a period that indicated the decline of an all-powerful state and the rise of a number of provincial and regional states with their own cultural religious processes taking shape. By the beginning of the 16th century, there were a number of feudal states like Bengal, Khandesh, Jaunpur, Malwa, Bihar, Kashmir and Sindh in the north, and Golconda, Bijapur, Bidar, Gulbarga, Ahmednagar, Berar in the south. And with the growth of these regional centers, there was also growth of magnificent temples all over India. which was an indicator of the newly acquired power and wealth of the Brahmins. A large number of land grants that had been given from the Gupta period onwards also resulted in these centers emerging as powerful centers. On the economic front, the Delhi Sultanate had released forces that led to the expansion of towns as well as alternations in agrarian conditions. As a result, by 14th century, there was a considerable growth of these towns and expansion both in craft production as well as commerce. Now, all this was happening due to several technical innovations, a number of changes in the various crafts due to the improvement in technology, for example, in sericulture, carpet weaving on the vertical loom, then introduction of the spinning wheel, that is charkha, in the cotton textile sector, the Persian wheel in irrigation, the introduction of paper, and appearance of magnetic compass as an aid to navigation, and the invention of correct timekeeping devices for the regulation of mercantile economic activities. The Araghata made it possible to drive the Persian wheel by animal power. So, the spinning wheel and weaving loom furnished with treadles, thereby increasing their efficiency to an unprecedented level. Now, while all these changes were taking place, which had no precedent, there also emerged new social forces. These innovations in technology and an expansion in craft production released social forces that led to the expansion of towns and also a change in agrarian relations. So, we come across several new social groups, new artisan and mercantile groups that emerged were drawn from outside the hereditary custom bound caste groups. For these groups, the newly acquired wealth did not enable them to assimilate into the prevalent hierarchy or increase their status. And a similar phenomenon had also happened during 6th century BCE, when during the second phase of urbanization, there was a lot of hierarchy that had been created, new social stratification, and the artisans and merchants who had been making lot of profits now wanted a better social status, which they were not finding in the old Brahmanical order, and hence they turned towards this new heterodox sects. So, in medieval period also, temple emerged as a center of power. It was a citadel of economic power, as well as it directed agricultural development through the endowments it received. These endowments were made in order to provide income for temple maintenance, for several festivals, etc. And so, several money investments that were received by these temples added to the income of the temples, and temples soon emerged as a nucleus around which several villages, towns, and commerce flourished. So, temples also came to play the role of a bank which would receive deposits, and they would also lend money. Now, all these changes resulted in a kind of nexus emerging between religion and polity. And as has been pointed out by several scholars, the Kalachuris, the Chalukyas, etc., all these regional kingdoms, they developed as seats of Veer Shaivism, and they believed in the construction of temples to further sanctify their royal power and also to provide them with a support base. So, the Brahman priests were the greatest beneficiaries of these huge endowments and the money power. The Chalukyas of Badami built no less than 72 temples in their capital Aihole between the 5th and the 7th century. And before the emergence of Veer Shaivism, Shaivites had constructed 450 temples, and the Vaishnavites had constructed around 100 temples in Karnataka. while the ruling class lent its patronage to these temples and priests, the priests and Brahman beneficiaries of the Brahmadeya grants endowed the kings with legitimacy and greater power. Now, it was in this background that Veer Shaivism emerged as a protest movement. The connection between economic exploitation and the socio-ritual oppression by the ruling class and Brahman coalition played a very important role. So, there was emergence of a socio-religious protest movement like Veer Shaivism. Also, one can talk about the Lingayat religious movement, which was born in the context of a divided and a highly exploited society, as the social base of the Lingayat movement largely consisted of the traders and the craft groups like weavers, tanners, the Panchala or the group of 5 smiths, and untouchable craftsmen like the Midara, that is basket makers, washermen, etc. Now, these craft groups probably joined the Veer Shaivite movement in anticipation of greater protection to their craft against the oppressive taxation and enslavement by the priestly intermediaries and the state. So, one can say that the Veer Shaivite movement was an important movement that challenged tradition, which originated in Karnataka in the 12th century, and it played a predominant role in overturning and in questioning Brahmanical authority and also questioning patriarchal values. So, it is with this kind of a thematic background that one can now make an entry into analyzing what was the role played by women in the Veer Shaivite movement and how relevant Veer Shaivite movement was to these female bhaktas. Thank you.